All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to get started just so we have enough time for the presentation and some of the open house activities. We have a great crowd in person and on Zoom, so thank you for joining us in this hybrid format. I first want to give a shout out to the Black Box for donating the use of their space for tonight's forum. Incredibly generous, and it's great that we can be in a location that's in our study area that really is kind of a model for the kinds of things that we want to see more of in Franklin Center. So first, just to give a little bit of background, this is our second public forum. We held the first one in March, and we've also done a number of focus groups. We held a community survey, done some more engagement with town stakeholders in order to understand a community vision for the Franklin Center area, and also to think about what kind of zoning recommendations make sense for enhancing the district. I want to thank our steering committee members. Most of them are here in the audience with us. From the City Council Economic Development Committee, we have Melanie Hamlin, Glenn Jones, Kobe Frangillo, and Patrick Sheridan. From the Zoning Board of Appeals, we have Bruce Hunchard. And from the Planning Board, we have Gregory Rondo and Beth Weirling. MAPC was initially hired by the town of Franklin to be a consultant to help lead this community-wide visioning process. And the purpose of this work is really to unlock development that can support local businesses, help lead to new businesses, expand housing options in the area, create really kind of a vibrant mixed-use neighborhood, and take advantage of new infrastructure that the district is lucky to have. I already thanked the Black Box, but I'm going to thank them again, just because we're very happy to be here. I'm going to try to get through my presentation as quickly as possible so that we have some time for Q&A at the end, and we'll be moving into an open house format that will look a little bit differently whether you're in person or remote. We'll explain that once we get to the end of the presentation. So everyone is aware we are recording tonight's meeting. It will be available on our website, on the Franklin for All website, also through Franklin TV, and all meeting attendees that are virtual are muted with their videos on. And we're asking if folks can save their questions for the Q&A portion of the evening. And at that time, we will ask people who are in person and also remote to raise their hands, and we'll just call on people. We might have to cut off the Q&A to make time for the open house portion, but any additional questions that folks have, we will make sure that we get those answered. Very generally, I think, this picture sort of sums up the vibrancy that Franklin Center already has, and we're really just trying to capitalize on these existing assets and to think about what kind of barriers might be preventing the area from fully realizing its potential as a mixed-use destination. When we refer to Franklin Center, this is the area that we are talking about in particular. So we are really focusing our efforts on the downtown commercial district, which is in purple on this map, and the C1 district, which is in light green. But we are also looking at what the opportunities are and what different kinds of options make the most sense for the single family residential 4 district. That's the pink area that takes up most of the study area. Also the mixed business and innovation district, that's the gray area to the left, and also the general residential 5 district. Part of why we're here, this is only part of it because, the town of Franklin has wanted to pursue a zoning project for a long time, and this just happens to coincide with a new state law that was passed in the last year or so. through the housing choice legislation. And what this regulation did in part was come up with a new multifamily zoning requirement for communities that have MBTA transit in them. It's called Section 3A to be short. And this requirement, in order to be eligible for sources of state grant funding, all communities would need to have at least one district in their community within a half mile of the commuter rail station that allows a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre by right, that can go through a more limited review process through something like site plan review, but it would have to be allowed by right. And the density can vary across sub-districts, but does need to even out to about 15 units by right. And at least half of the district must be within that half-mile radius from the commuter rail station. Part of this, what this legislation does is lay out the minimum unit capacity that each community would need to theoretically be able to account for. So in no way are we suggesting, or is the state suggesting, that we need to build 1,800 new units, but theoretically, this district would need to have a maximum capacity if it was fully built out for about 1,800 units. And so this is just kind of framing some of our thoughts. This is not the only reason why we're doing this project, but these sources of state funding are really important for Franklin, so we're trying to be cognizant of what kind of recommendations and different proposals will allow the town to comply. We held a community survey. We got great responses. Over 650 people filled out the survey. And the highest priorities that came out of that process were to support local business, create opportunities for new businesses, and to provide new public spaces where people can sit and gather. We asked people what kinds of uses, both housing types and land uses, they thought would make sense in each of the 5 districts that are in our study area. And survey participants felt that mixed-use development made the most sense for the downtown commercial, commercial 1, and mixed business innovation districts. Single-family made the most sense for the single-family residential 4 district, and different sorts of mid-density housing options, some smaller multifamily, duplexes, triplexes, et cetera, made sense in the general residential 5 district. In the commercial district, in the downtown commercial district, the most popular responses were retail shops, restaurants and bars, art galleries. Also, there was a priority for offices, service-related businesses, grocery stores, and fitness/gym amenities. In terms of density, we asked people if they felt like each of the districts could support more people, or if it really was kind of built out and has as many people as people think should be in those districts. And generally, folks felt like the DC and the C1 districts, as well as the Mixed Business Innovation District, could and should have more people and greater density, whereas they felt that the density in the general residential 5 and single-family residential 4 districts was just about right. There was a strong preference for traditional style buildings in the downtown, though some feel that design is the most important thing, and it's more important than what the style actually ends up being. Parking is definitely important, but people generally feel that they would rather prioritize walkability over being able to park immediately in front of their destination. And we also asked people if they thought we were including the right locations in our study area, and the overwhelming majority said that we were, so that's good. This is just a word cloud that came from all the words that we asked people to describe what their vision for the future of downtown Franklin would be. And so obviously the biggest words are the ones that had the most responses. So things that we heard a lot were walkable, parking, vibrant, accessible, diverse, restaurants, community. From here, we came up with a draft vision for Franklin Center. I'm not going to read through it right now because We will show it in the boards that are during the open house period, and I want to make sure that everyone can read this carefully, but this is sort of an amalgamation of all the community engagement we heard, trying to touch on the different priorities of this process, and generally the hope is that all of our recommendations that we put forward align with this vision. Very generally, the approach to rezoning that we are recommending at this point, though obviously we want to get people's opinions on it to see if we are on the right track, is to create, we're recommending the creation of a Chapter 40R Smart Growth Overlay District for the immediate downtown area that would try to balance some density while also ensuring high quality design. We are considering a supplementary townwide affordable housing requirement. The 40R Smart Growth District requires a minimum of all units be 20% affordable. So trying to think about what affordability could look like in other areas of the district. We're looking at some land use permitting changes to the base zoning districts to better incentivize the kind of commercial uses that folks want to see, and also housing types. Suggesting some programming to help manage parking and support business and property owners, and also thinking about some additional incentives for really good, outstanding projects that might come up. So like I mentioned, the first recommendation is around establishing a 40R Smart Growth Overlay District with design standards that includes properties in the downtown commercial, commercial 1, and general residential 5 districts. This legislation, this is a program that has been created by the state a number of years ago to encourage generally dense residential and mixed-use zoning that includes a minimum percentage of affordable housing and is located close to public transit, hence the smart growth phrase. Densities must be 8 units per acre for a single family, 12 units per acre for a townhouse, or 20 units per acre for a condominium and apartments. So as you can see, it does sort of line up with that Section 3A MBTA requirement that we're thinking about. And projects have to be developable as of right. However, the town can create very detailed design standards that would specify exactly what those projects must adhere to. And there are a number of financial incentives associated with adopting a 40R Smart Growth Overlay District. There's an initial one-time payout that depends on the projected net increase of units, and then the town would get an additional bonus payment for every new unit created. And also there's some eligibility for more preferential consideration when the town applies for other grants, including funding for new school buildings. So the zoning itself for a 40R district would be quite detailed, would say what kind of uses are allowed, what uses are prohibited, what those dimensions should be, what parking is required, how much affordable housing, what the plan approval procedure would look like, and also the planning board who would presumably be overseeing any applications under the zoning could waive certain requirements, particularly I think for really high quality projects that are providing community benefits like open space, rehabbing a historic property, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned, detailed design standards kind of make sure that even if a project is allowed as of right, it still is adhering to all these things that we say we want it to look like. So both architectural styles, but also, really nitty gritty down to the materials, the types of windows and doors, the lighting, landscaping. It really can run the gamut, and the planning board would have the discretion to deny a project if it wasn't meeting these standards. As I mentioned, this would align fairly well with the Section 3A requirement as an MBTA community, and like I said, the planning board could deny it if it wasn't meeting both the design standards and any other regulations associated with that zoning. What a 40R district can do is to really send a message to developers. They're generally aware of this program, and it says pretty clearly that Franklin wants development in this area, and it also sets clear standards for them to follow. It can be structured in a way that variances are not necessarily needed, which creates more certainty for developers and makes projects more likely to happen. And the funding that the town would get from the payments could be used to fund other programming, like public amenities or a facade and grant program, which we'll talk about later. Approximately 40 communities in Mass have already adopted these districts, and just a handful that I'll name include Reading, Northampton, Natick, Haverhill, Easton, Newburyport, Belmont, Westboro, and more. And these are just a few projects that were permitted under the 40R zoning. This is in Reading, the Postmark building. It's the conversion of an old post office with additional housing added. This is Village Hill in Northampton. This is Westboro Village. And this is not in a 40R district. This is right here in Franklin, but this just gives some perspective that this is a property that has a density of 20 units per acre. There's about 20 units in this building, and the property is almost exactly 1 acre. Recommendation 2 is around this more town-wide affordable housing policy. What inclusionary zoning essentially does, it sets a requirement for the minimum numbers of units in a project that need to be affordable, and this percentage usually ranges somewhere between 10 and 20%, and the town could specify what trigger would be required to provide these units, and usually that's somewhere between 5 and 10. In lieu of creating new units, a number of municipalities will also set up a payment in lieu system where if a unit isn't provided, a somewhat equal amount of funding would then go towards the Franklin Affordable Housing Trust, and that could be spent on creating new affordable housing in Franklin. This is meant to just create additional opportunities for new affordable housing. We know that there's quite a bit of need for folks to move to the community, stay in the community across different age groups. And generally, affordable housing requires a really large subsidy to make happen. That's either coming from a developer or coming from the government. And in order to help fill that gap between what an affordable unit would be priced at and what a market rate unit would go for, some places will allow density bonuses that can help offset the cost, because generally, if you could produce a few more units, that can pay for that subsidy that's needed to make a unit affordable. The next recommendation is around creating a specific definition in the zoning bylaw for mixed-use development and allowing this use by right in the downtown commercial and commercial 1 district, and potentially by special permit in the mixed business innovation and residential 5 districts. Right now, the bylaw doesn't include a definition for mixed use. Both residential and commercial uses are defined separately, and basically, in order for a project to happen as of right, both residential and commercial uses would need to be allowed. And this can create some undue confusion, and right now, mixed-use buildings are technically allowed in the downtown commercial district and by special permit in the commercial 1 district. And generally, the reason why we want to make it easier to understand what mixed use is and to build it is because that's really what people are telling us that they want to see, especially in the downtown core. Most folks indicated that in the DC, C1, and MBI districts, mixed-use buildings were the type of housing that they wanted to see, with commercial uses on the ground floor. And currently, the MBI district doesn't allow mixed use at all, but it might be a good option to create a special permit process for that if there was a really good project that made use of some of those buildings in that district, and theoretically, the planning board or the ZBA, whoever's regulating this, could decide how much of that property needs to be utilized for commercial if they wanted to make sure that it wasn't, all becoming residential. The next recommendation is to consider requiring a special permit for first floor offices and personal service related businesses in the downtown commercial districts in order to incentivize some of the uses that people have identified that they want to see more of, and ones that really can help create interactive storefronts where people want to stop and enter. These are places like retail shops, restaurants and bars, art galleries, craft maker spaces. Currently, there's a lot of service-related businesses like salons, eyeglass stores, tailors, and also offices that currently are on the ground floor of commercial and mixed-use buildings on some of the main streets in downtown Franklin. And though these uses, as their name implies, provide great services, they don't do much to activate the street and really draw visitors to the downtown. They don't necessarily make it they're not necessarily destinations. And so one potential way to incentivize some of those more vibrant uses is that those uses could be allowed by right all the time, whereas uses that aren't as pedestrian friendly would require a special permit if they were on the first floor. But if they were above that, on the second floor or any other floor, that would be allowed by right. And when a use becomes a special permit, if it's already by right, there's no change for those existing businesses that are there. Nothing, they're not penalized for anything, but any new proposal would require zoning relief. Our next recommendation is around creating a new definition for 3-family housing and allowing this by right in the commercial 1 and general residential 5 district, and potentially by special permit in the single-family residential 4 district. Right now, multifamily means anything more than 2 units, so a 3-unit building is considered in the same way that a 30-unit or 100-unit building is. So allowing 3 families by right in a few of the districts could enable these typologies in areas where buildings at a higher density might trigger that 40R district process if the town were to go that route. And allowing 3 families by special permit in the single-family residential 4 district is really trying to enable and legalize this use that already exists in a lot of places. There's already a number of 3-family homes. Most of them were constructed before zoning was ever created. Next, to consider allowing single-family uses by special permit instead of by right in the commercial 1 district. We heard people say that the area can and should have greater density, and given this desire, the town might want to consider allowing single-family homes, which are really the least dense option that exists, by special permit rather than by right. Right now, the DC district doesn't allow single-family at all, and again, this wouldn't impact any existing properties, but if a landowner wanted to convert, say, a duplex to a single family, that would require a special permit. And if they wanted to just build a new single family on an empty parcel in that district, it would also require that. The next definition is around creating the next recommendation is around creating a new definition for accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs or in-law apartments, and allow them by right on single-family parcels in the general residential 5 and single-family residential 4 districts. I just want to preface that this is also something that could potentially work in other districts outside the study area, but that's just our focus for this process at this time. And these accessory units could be either attached to the main building, detached. Maybe someone wants to convert a garage or a carriage house to a small 1-bedroom apartment. And they could really be done in a way that they match the existing context and they seemingly don't really add a lot of density to an area. And these can be an option to help homeowners stay in their home if they're able to generate some additional revenue from renting out a unit. And they also are a really good typology for seniors and folks with disabilities because it can give them independence and have their own space, but still be connected to family or caregivers that could help provide them with other services. Right now, ADUs are technically allowed by right in the general residential 5 district and allowed by special permit in the DC, C1, and single family residential 4 districts. Right now, it's not a specific definition for ADUs. They're referred to as 2-family by conversion. And because there's not really this clear definition, not clear guidance for regulating ADUs, people might not even be aware that their property would be eligible. And so we're also thinking that allowing ADUs by right in the single family residential 4 district could allow for some of these very subtle increases in density without having any impact on the character of single family neighborhoods. Our next recommendation is around establishing a shared parking program for the town-owned parking lots in Franklin Center, and this could also be an opportunity to work with the owners of private lots too. We heard a lot during this process that people are concerned that there's not enough parking or they can't find parking when they need it, and some people feel like this is a reason why there shouldn't be more density in the district. But at the same time, people also really want to prioritize walkability, and they indicated that they would be fine with walking a couple minutes from a parking space to their destination. So one thing we've considered is establishing a program to maximize the use of town-owned lots and, potential privately owned lots like the Rockland Trust lot, which is quite big. And this would essentially allow residents in some of these units in the downtown to utilize parking spaces in the town-owned lots at night when those spaces would otherwise be empty because businesses aren't open. There's about 130 parking spaces in the downtown between the 3 lots, and these would still remain prioritized for commuters and commercial uses during the day, but there would be set hours by which people can park there overnight. And generally, it would make sense to establish a kind of formal permitting program for this so that Franklin is able to track the number of vehicles that are utilizing this program. And obviously, if it's running close to capacity numbers, could scale it back. So it could be kind of a flexible way to utilize parking without having to build more. Our next recommendation is to establish a facade improvement program for small businesses and property owners in the downtown. We heard a lot that a few buildings could use some sprucing up, and that there's sort of a perception, at least at night, that areas of the downtown aren't safe, even though they are. Sorry. And so we are thinking about creating a program to provide either loan or grant funding to small businesses or property owners to help improve some of their buildings, like new signage, awnings, et cetera, and potentially funding this program through payments that came in through the 40R district or in lieu fees that could come from an inclusionary zoning program. This next recommendation relates to a fairly new program that the state has set up, the Municipal Vacant Storefront District designation, and essentially it could provide assistance from the state to aid small business owners to move into vacant storefronts. A number of people noted that there's a challenge with some vacant storefronts in the downtown. This is partly because it costs a lot to rent these spaces, and that makes them unaffordable, especially to small businesses. So we're trying to find ways that might incentivize some of those desired commercial uses in Franklin Center. We know that filling these vacancies will go a long way in terms of vibrancy, but also supporting local development and tax revenue. So this program that we're looking at, it was created in 2018 to encourage this, to encourage occupancy of vacant storefronts. And essentially the way it works is that the town would apply to be designated, to designate an area as a certified vacant storefront district. And then if they receive that designation, a business or an individual can apply to the state for tax credits of up to $10,000 to lease and occupy that vacant storefront. Municipalities must provide some matching funds, and to date, about 16 communities have been designated. And then our last recommendation is around utilizing tax increment financing for new businesses and development, specifically that provide really outstanding community benefits. Prioritizing projects in the Smart Growth Overlay District, but not only looking in that district if there were to be a really good project proposed elsewhere. The way tax increment financing works is that it basically utilizes tax increments, which is the difference between the current assessed value of a property and the assessed value later on after the district improves, infrastructure improves, and property values increase. And essentially, the assessor would calculate the tax that would come from the added value of the new construction, and could then grant property tax exemptions to landowners of up to 100% of that tax increment for a set period. And this helps provide upfront benefits to developers and can help fund construction costs. And obviously, you wouldn't want to create a TIF on every single project because the town is reliant on property taxes to fund the local budget. But I think for some really special circumstances where a business is bringing great community benefits to Franklin Center that might not be able to come otherwise, it could be a good option. So we've heard that people want to see a brewery, a grocery store in the downtown, for the movie theater to come back. And those could be all examples, or it can be something housing related that has substantial community benefits like public open space or more affordable housing. And Franklin has experience using TIF. They've used it about 4 times in the past, but those have all been in the industrial districts. It's never been utilized right in the downtown. So now we are gonna have some time for Q&A, and we'll probably do it for about 30 minutes, so we have time to do some of the open house activities. So if you are on Zoom, if you could use the raise hand function, so Sasha, who's there, can get your attention. And if you're attending in person, you could physically raise your hand. And we'll just plan on going back and forth between Zoom and in person to answer questions. Hello, do you want to come up to the microphone? Yes.
Emma, you're doing a great job.
Oh, thank you.
John Barry, 6 Baluchian Road. I've got 2 quick questions. What is deed restricted affordable housing? What does that mean?
Great question. So any affordable housing that generally is subsidized, meaning that money is coming from a private developer, coming from the government in order to say that a unit has to be affordable. A deed restriction that is associated with any property that you could own, you could put a deed restriction on it, and essentially says that that unit has to be designated affordable. It can only be rented or sold to someone who's considered low income for however long that deed restriction is. So sometimes they're a couple decades, usually around 30 years, and sometimes they're forever. And they're really the best way to make sure that affordable housing remains in the community because they're not subject to, the whim of the market. So they can't have a huge rent increase. It would have to be in line with the numbers that the federal government sets for what people's income has to be, the most you could charge for those units, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. What is the motivation for the state of Massachusetts for Franklin to create this zone in the downtown core? What's in it for them?
Do you mean the 3A district?
The
like
one
the
downtown.
MBTA?
Yeah.
So what's in it for the state? I think just trying to promote more, I think Baker's administration has been very vocal about the need for more housing, because part of the reason why housing is so expensive is because there's just not enough supply to meet the demand. So that's the big reason. Okay. I think that's the main
And even though
thing.
it's not in the downtown core, what were the 4 past TIF projects in the industrial area? I'm just curious if they've worked out.
Can someone, I'm not sure them by name. Is there, Brian?
Hi, so yeah, Brian Smyrna, Planning Director. The first one was back in 2006, and it never worked out, so I'm not even going to count that one. Tegra Medical in Forge Park was the first one that I was involved with. We did cold chain technologies, right? Yeah, exactly. And then Hamilton. They're actually the three in the industrial parks. They're all great companies, and it was worth keeping them happy and everything. Then many other times in the past where we've negotiated, got to a certain point, and then I realized that they didn't need the TIF to stay in town or whatever. But
Got it.
it's always okay. Thank you.
Great. Sasha, do you want to call on someone?
Before we call on Lily, I just want to note that we do have somebody joining on the phone. If you are joining over the phone, click *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Again, that's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. And just for the folks who are joining on Zoom, you should see a raise hand button at the bottom left of your Zoom screen. So where your microphone is, there should also be a little hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you're not seeing that there, click on participants, hover over your own name, and you should see a blue raise hand button that appears. And I'm going to invite Lily to unmute.
Which Lily, Sasha?
Whoever the Lily is who has your hand raised, you are unmuted right now.
Oh, and just a note, I think that we have a number of Lilies that are in the meeting just because of registration link that went out. So if your name shows up as Lily and that is not actually your name, you can, if you hover over your screen, there should be 3 little dots that you can click and you can rename yourself. So that might be helpful, especially if you wanted to ask a question so we don't, so we know what everyone's names are.
So the Lily Rivera who has your hand raised right now, you are unmuted.
Are you there?
Okay, I think we can move to the next person. This person muted themselves.
Okay, are you going to call on someone or should I pick someone from the audience?
We do not have any other hand.
Oh, okay. All right, is there anyone else in the audience? Okay, you want to go and then you? If you can, just so the folks on Zoom can hear.
I'm Mike Pradko. I'm curious as I look at all these recommendations and even the pictures of dense mixed-use development. You mentioned in the survey, and I'm thrilled that 650 people replied, but according to your own survey, the general residential 5 and the single family 4, people like me that replied said, we don't want more density there. We're fine with it in the downtown commercial, the C1 and the MBI area. But when I look at these recommendations, to me, it seems like we're going to get it whether we want it or not. So I'm really concerned that a lot of these recommendations put something in place that is going to lead to a density that is not what I think most of the people replied in the survey.
Right. So the single family district, the only additional use that we're suggesting to be allowed as of right would be accessory dwelling units. And those actually can work really well on single family parcels, especially bigger ones, because they generally might have some extra room for parking for that one extra unit. And, you know, can be pretty hard to tell if there is another unit there, just the way that they can be designed. The reason why we are making some recommendations around higher densities in the general residential 5 district, this sort of goes back to this MBTA requirement. We've done the math, and basically, if we were to just use the commercial 1 district in the downtown commercial district, we wouldn't have enough capacity to meet the requirement. So we do need to include some parcels in the GR5 district, not necessarily all of them, and we can get kind of specific if we want in terms of how we end up crafting the final dimensions of that. But that was one of the main reasons why we were kind of lumping that district in with the DC and the C1 district in order to meet that requirement. And then, do you want to go?
We do have some Zoom folks after this.
Okay, we will go to Zoom after.
Karen Landers on Union Street. I guess I'm in the pink district, SF4?
Yes.
So in that district, you can put in an accessory dwelling?
So right now, I believe they're allowed by special permit in that district, and we're suggesting allowing that by right. So, you know, it would still need to be permitted through the building department, but you know, theoretically, it wouldn't have to go to the ZBA or the planning board for extra approval of that.
And that would be just for one family?
So the way we phrased it right now, it would be on lots that already have a single family on them to create one additional unit. I think, you know, if a property already has 2 or 3 units and then you add another one on, that can kind of be getting a little tight. So, you know, properties. And you know, the town could set regulations for exactly how far apart it needs to be, how far that unit would need to be from the setback, what the minimum lot area would be. So it could still be regulated in the same way that a primary dwelling unit would be, but it kind of just creates a little bit more flexibility.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. All right, Zoom.
Okay, for Bob and Lily, I do see your hands. Because Judith was having technical difficulties, I'm going to start with Judith and then we'll go in the order of the hands raised. So Judith, I'm asking you to unmute.
Thank you very much. I apologize for that. I'm a software engineer. I should be able to figure this out. Anyway, a couple of questions. One is, you know, I know that we're supposed to have a certain population density within a half a mile of the train station. And they just constructed this huge apartment complex. Does that satisfy that requirement?
So the requirement is not for the number of units that have been built. It is specifically for what the capacity would be. So any existing units, it doesn't matter if your district is already fully built out or there's nothing there. It basically just looks at what is the zoning for that area, and if you built it out to the maximum capacity, how many units could you get? So, you know, I guess those are the kind of properties and developments that would be allowed, you know, depending on what the exact qualifications are, that could be allowed under that zoning. But you know, even the number of units that you have today doesn't really matter.
Okay, because I'm just thinking that, you know, with that added development, do we even need new construction in this area? That's why I'm asking this, because my understanding is that to meet the requirements of this new law, that there has to be a certain number of housing within a half a mile of the train station.
Exactly, but the way that they have calculated it, it's just based on the number of units that could be built. What has actually been built is not what they are looking at.
Okay,
It's not, it doesn't make the most sense, I'll admit it. And I'll just preface that it's still in draft form, so there might be some final changes that are made. So, you know, we're just kind of looking at things based on what those draft recommendations are.
Okay, because especially this is a fairly new development. I wondered if it was built after you guys started looking at the area, but
No, that had been through the process, I think, earlier. Yeah.
The other thing too is, I know it looks like people want restaurants, they want a gym, they want all this stuff, but parking is so limited. And you were saying that there were 3 lots that you were talking about, and I'm wondering where these lots are, because there's the Rockland Trust lot, there's a tiny lot for commuters, and a very small, adjunct lot up the hill for commuters. And then there's another lot down behind, like the restaurant area on west, I think it's East Central, sorry, right opposite, there's that whole group of buildings opposite the Rome restaurant. But that was filled in with a whole big apartment complex or condo complex back in there. So I don't know, other than the Rockland Trust lot, what parking options do we have in that area? Because I can't imagine a restaurant is going to do very well. An additional restaurant is going to do very well with the limited parking. In fact, that corner store right opposite the Rome restaurant has changed hands several times because there's just no good parking for it. And I think the Cake Bar is another one that's now something else, again, because there's just no good parking for it. So I guess I'm wondering, how these things are going to be decided and handled.
So I think the 3 lots that we were referring to, the Ferrara lot, the Depot lot, and then the Rockland Trust, but then there was one other, that was the library lot. Yes, the library lot. So
Postage stamps, right? Or postage stamps, So I guess, I'm all for diversifying and more restaurants and everything, but the ones that are there can't seem to stay in business. And I'm not sure why. I know restaurants go in and out of business at a much higher rate than most other business types, but I think a lot of the problem is the parking. So.
Right. I think part of this piece is how do we wayfind and direct people to the existing parking that exists, and just making clear where there are availabilities. And obviously we heard a lot about a parking garage in the downtown and that being a potential idea. That's a little bit out of the scope of our work because we're really looking at what we could change from like a policy and zoning standpoint. But, I think there are better ways to utilize the existing parking that exists. And obviously that might require some negotiation with private property owners. But parking is really expensive to build. So if there are ways that we can better utilize it and not add more asphalt, I'm sure that would be a benefit.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Alan Earls from Marvin Avenue. I have a lot of questions, but I'll make it 3 quick ones. The first one, has there been any consideration to bringing the old and non-conforming, very dense streets into some kind of zoning plan? It may not matter, but I'm curious, like Cottage Court is very dense, and there's always municipal kerfuffles over how those people are treated for public services. Second, the build-out you're proposing potentially, do you have a sense of what the population of that, how many people would be in Franklin when that happens, 50,000, 80,000? And do we have anywhere near enough water for that? That's been an issue for decades here. And lastly, is there any way we can get larger size plans than these little postage stamp things so we can look more closely at things?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, we do have a larger plan there, and we can make all these materials available by PDF. So the question around the infrastructure, we have had in-depth conversations with the engineering department and all of the DPW staff, and they've made clear that there really aren't capacity issues that they're worried about. There are upgrades that will need to be made eventually down the line that are going to happen whether or not there's more density. Just if there's a lot more people, that might speed up when some of those things happen. That was the understanding that that I got, but they're not particularly concerned. They think that what we're talking about here is not something that they're flagging. Your other question. So again, even if we are theoretically creating the capacity for these 1,800 units, that definitely does not mean that all of them are going to be built out, especially because there's a number of properties that have recently been redeveloped. So we are doing some more calculations with the build out figures that we should be able to have available. I haven't gotten to my next step slide, but we are going to plan to have a booth at the Strawberry Fest where we'll show some more updates and additional research that we've pulled. So we should have some more kind of realistic numbers there, because I think that that capacity number is not really indicative of what's actually going to happen. Sasha.
Yes, so the next person is Bob Archibald.
Hi, I live in the Chestnut Ridge condos off of East Central, and they've just built a large condo apartment complex next to the Big Y. And following up on Alan's question, I'm curious as to how the intended developments might impact water usage. We never seem to have enough water around here, and that complex, I think, has 104 units. It's bound to tax it even further. If I understood you correctly, it sounded as though you're saying the DPW isn't worried, but they don't seem to be taking any action yet either. So just curious as to whether you know any specific plans that are going to take place to add to our water capacity.
So I do have some more details on that I could probably pull up. Again, I think they have recognized that improvements are going to need to be made in probably the next 10 years or so, and the amount of development that happens might speed that up a little bit. They said that I think Franklin, because of a state regulation, there are limits on watering, and so there's the impression that there's not enough water, but that's actually a regulation that is coming from the state around that usage. So my understanding is that DPW is not concerned about water and sewer capacity at this point in time, and what we're proposing here is not concerning them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. All right, next.
I'm Leslie McCaffrey, and I just have an issue with parking again. You just said 1,800 units. If you times that by 2, that's 3,600 cars. So where are these cars going to park if we want to make this a walkable community? And also, what do you envision the capacity of each apartment to be? How many people are you expected to live in these apartments?
So again, 1,800 units is not what needs to be built. That's just purely what the numbers need to say this zone could have capacity for, which I think is a really important distinction. So I don't have an exact number right now for how many parking spaces we think would need to come out of that. Generally, there would still be the requirement that each of these buildings include enough parking. And then with the shared parking, that's more thinking about how do we use those spaces during the off hours when they're not being used by other businesses.
It's parking is a serious issue, especially with the new bakery in town. You can't even get a place to park to shop there. So those are my concerns.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Thank you. Oh, sure. Sasha?
The first Lily Rivera at 9, and just you to unmute. Okay, Lily, you are unmuted. If you're having trouble with your microphone, can you put your question in the chat and I will read it out loud? And again, I'll just note we're not taking any other questions in the chat. This is just to address a technical difficulty.
Do we want to just move on to the next person while that comes through?
Yes, let's do that. So I'll unmute John.
Hi, John McGadge, Surrey Way. Just curious as to whether this law that the Baker administration put forth to, I guess, promote MBTA ridership from communities along the lines could be satisfied by providing shuttle bus transportation to the large multi-family units that have been built around Franklin. We have quite a few condo and apartment developments, some of which have been mentioned during the meeting tonight. And I just wonder whether, you know, rather than clogging up the downtown area with additional dwellings, whether we could maintain the character of the town a little bit more by using shuttle bus services instead.
Sure. Well, the regulation definitely requires that at least half the district be within a half a mile. And I don't know how much flexibility there will be around that. But again, I just want to preface that this is just about the number of potential units that could be created. We are not recommending, 1,800 units be built right in the downtown. Yeah.
Front row, you don't know who you're calling on. So, hi, Emma, thank you. Beth Whirling, 164 Main Street. I appreciate all the work that you put into this. It's been a lot to process, I'm sure.
Speak up a little bit.
Oh, sure, sorry. I can, thank you. Couple clarification questions for you. I think you had noted that the single family 4 zoning district, you're only looking for the accessory dwelling unit change. But did you mention also that they were looking for 3 families by right as well?
So in that district, we were suggesting by special permit.
By special permit, okay. And then when the MBTA communities, 3A came out, was there also information about accessory dwelling units by right, specific sizes that was recommended?
So that only covers units that are 3 or more, or buildings that are 3 or more units.
I thought there was something for accessory dwelling units too.
I don't think so. Lydia, do you?
I don't believe so,
No?
but again, they're drafts, so
Okay.
it could change.
But not under MBTA communities, separately, altogether separate, there was something for accessory dwelling units, so.
It might have been something related to like one of the majority.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So when looking at this for Franklin, is that something we can look at as a base to start for consideration if we do go down that path? Because I think the size, whether it was attached or a detached, was actually seemed pretty reasonable for consideration. So it's something to think about.
Yeah.
Yep. And then you had mentioned the MBTA communities is still in its draft form, and knowing that they've gone through a whole bunch of public meetings, public settings, do you know the timeline? Is it still a July timeframe for when they plan to come out with the final guidance? Or
That is my understanding. I'm not aware that they've pushed it off more.
Do you, exactly, you never know, right? Do you anticipate any big changes coming forth? As I know many communities that are dealing with this are not too pleased with the guidance that's come out. And do you see the governor making any major changes? I know it's hard because of the way that it's written. You can't make significant changes.
Right, so they can't really change stuff that was written in the legislation, but there are certain things that they might be able to change that are just in the programmatic rules. So one thing I'm not sure about is if that capacity number will change, because that is not something that was specifically referenced in the the legislation, but it's hard to tell. There's also no mention of affordability right now, and so that might be something that they integrate. MAPC, the agency, suggested, like, is there a way that affordable units could count more, so that way you can still meet that capacity requirement, but, get more points if some of those units are affordable.
And do you think with 40R, being able to do design guidelines that can be really, pretty stringent and strict, and do you think that could be something that could prohibit us from doing MBTA with communities?
I don't think it would, because it would still be considered by right.
Okay. Even though you have design guidelines, it's the MBTA community seems pretty, clear that you need to have it by right without a lot of restrictions.
I do think they are still allowed. I mean, I know 40R requires by right, and they allow design standards, so.
But something to consider when,
absolutely.
that the, final legislation isn't coming out until, or guidelines aren't coming out until July, so hopefully there's no significant changes that will impact your.
Right.
guide. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Emma, I just want to note that the microphone is not, it's a little hard to hear not from your mic, but from the audience mic.
Okay. So I'm thinking maybe we should take like 2 more questions and then transition into the open house portion of the evening. The last slide that I'll show has my email address and has Brian Taberner's email address. And so if people have any other questions and you're not in person and you can't come up and ask us during the open house portion, I would suggest that you please email them, whether they're comments or questions, and we can definitely get back to you. And, if there are questions that we think other people can really benefit from hearing the answers to, we could publish, like a Q&A output. So I think let's take one more question in person and then one more over Zoom, and then we will transition.
Hi there.
Hi.
Megan Benson, Winthrop Drive. So I apologize if I've missed this, but so there was 11 different recommendations. The first one I know mentioned like the Section 3A. How did the rest of them kind of meet that requirement, or do they?
Sure. So I would say that really it's only the first one that is really meeting that requirement, because that's the one that is setting kind of the standards of what is allowed by right or not.
Right.
And specifically, it's multifamily or mixed use allowed by right. I think the other ones are more trying to get at some of the other things that we heard during this process. So trying to promote businesses, good development. But I think really it's the 40R that would be the main tool for meeting that requirement.
I'm assuming you'll talk about next steps, but like in terms of, will it be one recommendation that we could adopt? Is it multiple? How does that work?
Sure. So right now we're kind of throwing out slightly high level versions of the recommendations just to get people's thoughts on them. Then what we'll do is publish, basically for each of these recommendations, we might get rid of some if people are like, no, this is a terrible idea, this will never work. And we'll kind of have more specific action steps on what it actually would take to implement any of these things. Generally, I would say all of them, if not most of them, would require a city council vote, and there would be kind of a whole public process associated with that.
Okay. But basically, in terms of meeting this Section 3A, the only recommendation that would get us there is that first one?
No. We sort of analyze different kind of zoning approaches. So the town could just do its own overlay district. It doesn't have to do the 40R. We are recommending the 40R just because it kind of comes with these other incentives. It's just a program that has proven that it can work. Like a number of towns have really seen great enhancement that have come from it. But that's not the only way you could do it. So if that seemed like it wasn't flexible enough for Franklin, we could still just create, a local overlay district that would meet those requirements.
Okay, all right, great, thank you.
Thanks. All right, one of the Lilies.
I am going to read out the question from Andrew Waples, who is the person who could not unmute. So Andrew Waples, Hancock Road. I am in favor of mixed use, but echo the concerns about project viability due to lack of parking and costs of expanding water system to accommodate increased population. My question is, has there been a cost-benefit analysis? How much will costs increase, school, police, fire, etc., compared with increased state funding? Also, the presumption is that people will be riding the commuter rail, but we will add 1,900 more cars to an already busy town. Has this element been reviewed? Thank you.
So we are looking at all of these things, and I'm hoping that we have some more specific numbers to share at the Strawberry Stroll when we have more, when our recommendations are a little bit more finalized. Can you just repeat?
Yeah, which part?
Oh, that's my face. The first part of that question.
Yes. Has there been a cost-benefit analysis? How much will costs increase compared with increased state funding?
Sure. So haven't done that level of analysis yet. I think one thing that we are thinking about is the kind of infrastructure upgrades that can happen with a new development project, because basically you can sort of have a developer take on those costs as they do that project, and that is a way to kind of upgrade infrastructure on kind of a piecemeal basis without the town having to expend those funds. In terms of the costs around school children, I know that most of these buildings are probably going to be 1 or 2 bedroom units, and so generally the research has shown that those are not the main drivers of new school age population. It's really coming from turnover in the single family homes, and there's not really a correlation between increased school population and this kind of increased density, just because it's more young professionals, empty nesters who are utilizing these properties. But I think we can definitely try to get some more specific numbers around what those town expenditures would be. Okay, well, I know there are a few more questions, and so if anybody is here in person, you can feel free to come up to me or ask any of the steering committee members questions during the open house part of the night. And as I mentioned on the last slide, which I'll get to, my email address is there and Brian's email address is there. So if there's anyone online who has an additional question, please feel free to reach out to us in any way that works for you. So we will be refining the draft recommendations based on what we hear tonight, and we're also going to be producing some diagrams that could visualize the kinds of buildings that the zoning we ultimately propose could enable. We are going to have a booth at the Strawberry Stroll, and we'll be presenting some of those more final recommendations and some images for feedback, just to continue engaging. And from there, we will finalize and release publicly our final recommendations. And then the actual rezoning process is a whole other thing, and that will likely begin this fall. And so, that will consist of public meetings to hear from people about what, more specifics they would want to see, and then also the actual meetings that would happen with the city council, potentially the planning view, however the town decides it wants to implement that. So thank you so much. Here is our project website where we post everything, and we will try to get the PDF from tonight, from our presentation, and also the recording up there, hopefully by tomorrow, if not the day after. And again, as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please write down my email address, and I'm happy to touch base with you later. So from here on now, we are going to break into our open house. And so folks who are in the audience, you can feel free to get up and move around. We have different boards which just have descriptions of the draft vision statement, the different recommendations. Then we also have a space for any additional thoughts. There's some Post-its and pens in the back on the tables, so you could just use that as your landing spot. And for folks who are online, Sasha is going to help set you up on Jamboard. We've basically set up equivalent boards online as what exists in person, so you all can participate in the same activity. We created 3 different links, so depending on where your last name falls in the alphabet, we're just asking that people split up the Jamboard that they get to, just so we can make sure that we don't have any capacity issues, because apparently that can happen. So I'm gonna hop off, but Sasha is going to stay on the Zoom, and she can help anybody. She will give you those links to the Jamboard, and she will just be there to answer any questions that you might have. And if you do have a project-specific question that you really want answered, you can flag Sasha, and we might be able to liaise. So thank you so much.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.